Well, first of all, thanks very much, Stephanie, for the invitation, Valerie for organizing it all. It's wonderful to be at this workshop. I've never been to Grenoble, so that's very nice. I had some time this morning and in this beautiful weather to discover, so I went up to the Bastille and took this picture. I'm very scared of heights normally, and I made it. Anyway, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about simulations in economics, and in particular, essentially, I'm going to defend their use. And there's some previous work I've done on the topic, and sort of an earlier work. I've also tried to defend or promote the use of simulation modeling in economics. So far, that hasn't made a difference. So I thought, I might try again. And anyway, that's what I'm going to do. So despite, and I think many of the arguments, anyway, or the thrust of the arguments isn't really new at all, because in the literature, from what I can see among philosophers, methodologists of economics, they all think simulations are great, but nevertheless, they aren't used very much. I think what I present in this paper is a new analysis of why this is the case, and perhaps a new remedy. And I think it all has to do with objectivity, really, what economists think objectivity is. And I think it's a mistaken ideal. And so by sort of trying to undermine the ideal, I'm trying to make simulations seem more attractive to economists. That's it, really. But to begin with, philosophers tend to like to define things first. To be clear, I want to very briefly discuss 3 alternative definitions of simulations that have been given. And so just for you to see what I'm going to talk about. So first is this one that you find a lot in the literature, that a simulation refers to the use of a computer in solving an equation that is not or cannot be solved analytically. The problem with this definition is that it's far too narrow. There are many kinds of simulations, sometimes even used in economics, but surely used in other disciplines such as ecology, cellular automata, agent-based modeling, and so on, where mathematics or mathematical equations do not play any role whatsoever. And so those kinds of simulations wouldn't be covered under that definition. The second one here is from Stefan Hartmann, really. Which says that simulation is the mimicking of one process by another computer process. This particular definition, I think, is both too narrow and too wide, because surely one can mimic one process with another one without it being a simulation. It could just be mimicry. But also, this focuses only on the dynamical aspects of simulations. And many simulations might simulate a static system, for instance, or anyway, systems where the temporal evolution doesn't play a role. And so that also doesn't work. And so here then is my alternative definition, proposal, which I do only apply to economics. So here I'm saying simulations in economics explore the properties of computer-implemented models. They are aimed at drawing inferences about properties of a socioeconomic system or socioeconomic systems of interest. And so the point here is that there's a model that is implemented on a computer. What you do with a simulation is explore what is true in the model, and you do that in order to draw inferences about characteristics of socioeconomic systems of interest. And related then, again, very briefly, and I've written about this before, but just so we're all on the same page, here's a very, very brief sketch of what I take to be a good epistemology of simulations. And so, because and that sort of played a role in earlier work, I do think that simulation modeling, mathematical modeling, experimentation, and other techniques all share the same fundamental epistemology, which is essentially a sort of four-step epistemology that I sketch here. So in the first step, a model is either chosen, if it's natural, or it's built as a stand-in for some system of interest. So, you don't really want to, experiment too much. If you're a biomedical researcher on humans, and so what you choose is some model organism, fish or rats or whatever, and which you think represents certain aspects of human biologies very well. So you choose a model or build a model as a stand-in for your system of interest. Secondly, you introduce some variation on the model, which produces some data set. And then you use these data in order to make an inference about some property or some characteristic of the model, which then in turn you use to make an inference, to draw an inference about your original system of interest. And the research is justified in making the inferences to the extent that errors in making inferences have been controlled. And so here I'm just using two very stupid, simple examples. So if the data that is being produced is given by a correlation between two variables, then you might infer a causal relation between these two variables. But that inference is justified only to the extent that, well, some other explanation, for instance, there's a common cause or there's selection bias or what have you, has been controlled for, right? So that kind of error, that source of error, has been controlled for. So this is in the step from the data to making an inference about the model. But then also there are similar errors in the inference from the model result to the target result. For example, you want to ask whether the model organism, or what the result about the model organism generalizes in the relevant way to the target population. And so, that might be another error. And so your inference is justified to the extent that these kinds of errors have been controlled for. Just to give you a picture here, anyway, this is just what I said. So you choose a model. The model is meant to represent stand-in for the target. You introduce a variation. The variation produces some data. You use those data to infer a model property or some statement about a model property, which then you can use to infer a target property. And this, I think, is a similar, identical epistemology, no matter whether you look at computer simulations, real experiments, thought experiments even, or mathematical models. Of course, what is different between those different things are the sources of error. And therefore methodologies very often are very dissimilar, are very different from, between these different methods. But, the general epistemology is the same. Okay. Then here are then some prima facie reasons that philosophers and methodologists have been given why socioeconomic systems should be modeled using computer simulations. And so here are just some examples. Most economic systems, socioeconomic systems, are experimentally inaccessible. So for instance, their whole economies, they're just too large. It would be unethical to intervene just for the sake of finding out something about the economy, or it was just simply not possible. You can make experiments with smaller scale systems, with a classroom full of students, but very often that's not very representative of anything because you have to introduce all sorts of artifacts to get the experiment reliable, that it's very unrepresentative of the population you're interested in. Experimentation itself also often introduces artifacts. An example that will be important later is, so if you use a randomized trial in order to find out whether some treatment is effective, and if the treatment is a socioeconomic one, not a medical one, then people often react in strange ways because they're being given a lottery and they don't like to play a lottery. And so very often you get differential attrition rates between, in relevant ways, between people who simply react differently to playing lotteries. Simulations are vastly more flexible than traditional mathematical models. This is a point that has been stressed by Paul Humphreys. So that's Paul Humphreys here, who says it in this way. Because of their increased computational power, simulations usually allow a reduction in the degree of idealization needed in the underlying model. Idealizations that often must be made in analytical modeling to achieve tractability. Because they are free from many of the practical limitations of real experiments, simulations and numerical experiments allow more flexibility and scope for changing boundary and initial conditions than do empirical experiments. So that's just that point. But in particular, some typical characteristics of social systems should lead us to think that simulations are very useful tools. And so if you use agent-based models, for instance, you can put in, depending on how you program it, but you can put in different agents that have different characteristics, for example. That essentially isn't done in the mathematical models that you typically find in economics. So for instance, in the real business cycle modeling literature, the entire population of consumers is represented by one single representative agent, and which is of course crazy, because surely households where there are two people, both of whom work and they have no kids, have very different preferences and different ways to react to changes in the economy than a household made up of one retired person, say. But then if the ratio of retired households to households in the labor force changes, that will change the economic relations in the market. And you simply cannot represent this kind of thing with a traditional mathematical model as it is used in economics typically these days. And so in a simulation model, in an agent-based model, you can easily introduce heterogeneous agents. Also open systems, again in the typical mathematical model, that's a closed model. Simulations models can be coupled to changes in the real world by feeding in data as they appear in the real world, as they are measured in the real world. So this month, December, eventually there will a new inflation rate pop up for Switzerland or for France for this month, and we could feed it into a computer that in real time develops. Also agents are very often responses to theorizing about them, and in the same way we can implement that kinds of behavior in a simulation model. So there are tons and tons and tons of a priori reasons to think that simulation should be used in economics. Nevertheless, why does this not work? Nevertheless, they are completely underused. And so I made a little empirical study about this topic and came up with these data here. So you do find, so I looked at abstracts in EconLit, a database for economics papers and theses and books and so on. And essentially I looked at the word simulation, simulate and so on in title and abstract. And what you find is, and you should find something like that. So from the 1970s here, there's a great increase over time. And this is just what you would expect. If, however, you look at the proportion of articles or proportion of publications on simulations, well, that is very low. So that, from about 0 to under 3%. So under 3% of the articles in economics actually do use simulations. And then I actually wanted to continue that. So for the next few years, so I did exactly the same again for the years after 2006. And what you see is actually it's leveled out a little bit. It's still increasing, but more at a slower rate. But then if you look at the proportion of articles, it's almost completely flat. So this is 100%, so it just kept flat at 3%. But then again, if you look more closely, well, you see it increased a tiny little bit, but essentially around 3%. And so the proportion of articles that present simulation work is tiny in economics, despite all these advantages. Now, and even the results I presented here probably overestimate the simulations of the kind that I am interested in. Remember, where you build a model in order to make an inference about a target system of interest, a real-world system, because very often there are Monte Carlo studies examining purely properties of statistical distributions. And so this guy said, Fontana, this guy estimated that up to 80% of the social science simulations are actually these kinds of simulations, which only look at properties of statistical distributions. So they are not at all empirically motivated simulations. So why then do economists continue to shun, to ignore simulations? So one qualification I want to mention, I'm not arguing at all that there are no simulations. There are people who use them. It's just that they're relatively rare, and that it's not the preferred technique found in the most prestigious journals. So look at the latest issue of the American Economic Review or the Economic Journal, or any of these journals. You won't, by and large, find simulations, and that it's not used by the best-known economists, and that simulations simply aren't rewarded. Have you seen a single Nobel Prize in economic science on simulation models? I haven't.
Schelling.
Who's that?
Tom Schelling.
Yeah, well. Okay. Anyway, so in an earlier paper, Aki Lehtinen and Jako Kurikowski argued that economists don't like simulations because they don't give us the right kind of sort of epistemic virtues. And they argued that simulations don't give us the kind of certainty economists want. And so if you have a mathematical proof, you know it's true. You can check every single step in the derivation, whereas a simulation is more experimental, it's more black box. We don't know what we put in, why whatever comes out does come out. So you don't get the kind of certainty. And that is related to a certain kind of understanding that you get. So you haven't understood a socioeconomic system unless you've modeled it yourself mathematically, is the idea. Be that, I mean, I don't want to comment on this at all, but their main point is descriptive. So they want to say, as a matter of fact, economists don't like that. But my project is a different one. It's a normative one. What should they like? So in this earlier paper I mentioned, I wanted to make simulations attractive because they are, as I said in the beginning, like experiments. Everybody agrees that experiments are reliable, and therefore, you should trust simulations just as much as you trust experiments. Now I think actually that this was a bad rhetorical strategy to use, and I want to use in this paper a different rhetoric that has to do with objectivity, because experiments actually are also very controversial in economics, and I think sort of the real villain is a mistaken ideal of objectivity. And so for the rest of this paper, I'm going to talk about objectivity and how that relates to simulation modeling. So there are three kinds of objectivity. And I think really that is, so objectivity is a multifaceted notion, and there are probably many more kinds, but I found it very useful to think of objectivity as sort of this three-pronged concept, or this concept that has three different, importantly different meanings. And they all mean the absence of something. So objectivity in the first sense is the absence of perspective. So humans observe the world from the human perspective, because, for instance, humans have a certain size. They can see very well mid-sized objects, but they can't see very well at all things that are very small or things that are very large. We have color vision, and so things appear to us as colored. But other beings might not have color vision and might therefore have a different impression of the world. So humans, in the first instance, observe the world from a perspective. But then there's this view that one can transcend that particular perspective And the task of science is it to model the world as it really is, in the absence from any perspective, as it would appear to some being that didn't have a perspective at all, from God's eye point of view, so to speak. That's really the aim of science. So that's one view. The next view is that personal biases and idiosyncrasies are bad. So Till, for instance, has mentioned all these biases that you have because your perceptual apparatus is not good enough, or you just make these mistakes. So these individual mistakes aren't good. Of course, interests, financial interests, for instance, are a bad thing. And your objective, to the extent that you've controlled these individual personal biases and idiosyncrasies. And then three, the third concept is that that science is free from extra evidentiary assumptions, and in particular, and I'm not talking about other kinds of assumptions, in particular from value judgments. There's an important distinction between what is and what ought to be, and science is not in the business of telling us what ought there to be. It's in the business of telling us what there is. And so all these three ideas are very influential in economics, and they're all mistaken. Anyway, and if we get rid of them, we can open the door to simulations. That's essentially the idea. So, the view from nowhere. I already mentioned what the basic idea is. There are two worlds. There's a world as it appears to us, but then there's a real world, a second world, that is as it would appear to some god if he existed, if she existed. That as it would appear to any kind of being stripped of specific sensory modalities. There's reality. And that's an ancient idea that goes back to ancient Greece. In science, I think it's who changed scientific method to accommodate this idea is Galileo, probably. So Galileo thought that complex phenomena are the product of a certain reality behind those phenomena and disturbing factors. So if you think of the law of the free fall, for instance, then the law that he describes, the real law, is a law that holds only under certain kinds of conditions that are never instantiated in the real world. But in the real world, they're sort of subject to disturbing factors such as air resistance or any other forces that act on the falling body apart from gravity. But then science should be about those, the reality behind those phenomena. And how do you get there? Well, essentially you strip off all the disturbing factors, write down the law for the isolated causal factor, and then you hope that with that knowledge, and then knowledge about how the disturbing factors work, you can sum up sort of what happens in the in the world as it appears to us. This general idea in economics has become popular probably with John Stuart Mill. I think that Carl Menger is even a more forceful, more consistent applier of this idea, but it's certainly in Mill. And here the idea is that, well, as in natural science, there is some privileged aspect of socioeconomic phenomena, the economic aspect. Now that's the true reality behind the phenomena. And then they add that the laws that describe true economic reality are already known, they're intuitively known through casual empiricism, or they're just sort of built into our brains, hardwired. But then we can predict what happens in actual socioeconomic systems by putting together the knowledge that we have about the economic aspect, with the laws about the disturbing factors. And so really the idea, that presupposes that the method of analysis and synthesis works, right? So write down one law for the essential causal factor, but then we can predict what happens in a more complex situation by adding in the disturbances, because we also understand those laws. And so if you think this is a crazy idea, this might work for physics, and but this is a crazy idea for economics. Here's just one. It's an excerpt from an interview that the New Yorker held with, this is Eugene Farmer, who just received the Nobel Prize in economics, about financial, and actually he is the inventor of the random walk hypothesis and efficient markets, or the efficient market hypothesis. And so, he was asked about this, and, how does this, in the aftermath of the crisis, how can you explain, and so on. And then here's what he says. So Cassidy, John Cassidy was the interviewer. Many people would argue that there was a credit bubble that inflated and ultimately burst. And then he answers, I don't even know what that means. People who get credit have to get it from somewhere. Does a credit bubble mean that people saved too much during that period? I don't know what a credit bubble means. I don't even know what a bubble means. These words have become popular. I don't think they have any meaning. Meaning, you see, that what he's doing, or where he sees his role, is in writing down the model that works under these isolated conditions and that have very, very little bearing to reality. He doesn't even know what a credit bubble is. And here's one of our greatest financial economists commenting on the recent crisis. And then that continues. So Cassidy asks, so what caused the recession if it wasn't the financial crisis? That's where economics has always broken down. We don't know what causes recessions. Now, I'm not a macroeconomist, so I don't feel bad about that. We've never known. Your view is that in 2007 there was an economic recession coming on, which was then reflected in the financial system in the form of lower asset prices? Yeah. Imagine that. He doesn't even care. And he thinks that, anyway, these real-world phenomena, well, look, I'm not a macroeconomist. And so I think sort of this view that there is one world that is described in economic models and theories, and there's this different world that is messy and so on, is actually very, very prominent in economics. But there are some problems with it. One is, how do we know which aspect of socioeconomic phenomena is the privileged one? Well, what Mill and Menger, Lionel Robbins, other methodologists do is they define economics, and then everything follows from that definition. So John Stuart Mill, for instance, says economic science is the science that tracks everything that arises out of the greed motive. Well, and then that's his economics, right? So everything that follows from greed. But of course, that's to a great extent arbitrary. So where does that privileged aspect come from? Then where do the laws come from? They all say by intuition. Well, but what if people's intuitions differ? How can we justify these laws and not others? And they are all adamant that we can't test them against real-world phenomena because they are messy things, right? And then lastly, this method, as I mentioned, presupposes that the method of analysis and synthesis works. So essentially that we can write down the law for the isolated causal factor, and then we can make a prediction about what happens in a more complex situation by adding in the disturbing factors. However, by and large, as far as we know, in socioeconomic systems, it doesn't work like that. So essentially, anything can happen. I have about 15 years of experience with experimental economics. And whenever I go to a conference, there's a new paper saying that, well, look, so here's a new experiment which more or less replicates what was done in this previous experiment. However, we varied this strange thing, and something completely different came out as a result. And so, if you run experiments, for instance, public goods experiments, it matters whether you know the other person. Well, that makes sense. Whether your opponent is a person or isn't a person. How well you know that person, who exactly it is. it matters whether or not you shield the different players from each other by adding in screens between their computer terminals, but also very strange things. It matters, for instance, whether after a few rounds, so these are games that you play over 20 or more rounds, that after a few rounds you make a break, and then you make another break. And that completely changes the results. And so by and large, socioeconomic factors seem to be interactive rather than additive. And that poses a problem for this method of analysis and synthesis, because what a causal factor does in isolation simply does not predict very well what it does in other circumstances. So that is a problem. Here in the context of simulation, just one thing I wanted to mention. There is one part where one part of the economics literature where simulations are used, but they are Monte Carlo experiments essentially. And what is being done here is that the structure of the economy is modeled and that is fixed, but then there are many parameters whose values are unknown. Some of them are then sort of guesstimated in the ways that Till just described, but then others researchers have just no idea about. And what is done then is that using Monte Carlo techniques, the economy is simulated and it is tried to replicate certain essential correlations, and then values for these open parameters are being found. So for instance, there's Oken's law. Oken's law says there should be a negative correlation between growth and unemployment. So that is something that should also happen in the model, and then combinations of parameter values are sought that produce this negative correlation. But the one criticism that has been made of that methodology is that, well, it's never used to actually test alternative hypotheses about the fundamental causal structure of the economy. And this is, of course, very consistent with this view of objectivity, right? So there is this economic aspect whose workings we already understand, so we only have to fill in the details and not worry about the fundamental structure. But there are all these problems, and therefore we should abandon it. Number two, how much time do I have actually?
10 minutes?
Okay. Freedom from personal bias. There's a recent debate in econometrics and a recent event in econometrics called the credibility revolution. And I think this is a very good example of this idea of how we should get rid of extraneous assumptions, personal biases, and so on, idiosyncrasies. And so traditional econometrics, which goes back to the Coles Commission, their work in the 1950s, is that econometric models, econometrics requires empirical models to be derived from economic theory. Also links up with the first sense of objectivity. So if we want to study a certain empirical phenomenon, we cannot write down the model unless it's derived from economic theory. The problem is that researchers, because economic theory is so loose, when it comes to actual empirical work, researchers can never agree on the correct theoretical background assumptions. And especially if you look at the literature on development economics, there's just this vast literature about factors that might or might not cause growth. And depending on the functional form you choose, depending on the covariates you choose, you simply get completely different results. And so the idea was then, this is the idea behind the credibility revolution, let's mimic biomedical research and run randomized controlled trials, for instance, to test whether certain development strategies are effective, or use econometric study that resemble randomized trials, and they are called instrumental variable studies. And essentially, instrumental variable studies and randomized trials are structurally identical. And so let's do that. And so we can get rid of these theoretical background assumptions that are personal, that every scientist would choose a different set of assumptions. And here we have an objective methodology, namely RCTs or instrumental variable studies. And then the idea is that we can learn a causal effect, or when we can learn a causal effect in an RCT or in instrumental variable studies, we know that little bit for sure. And then we can systematically build on this foundation, we can build further knowledge on this sure foundation. Well, but there are many, many problems. I shouldn't go through, well, anyway, just very briefly. So for instance, randomization limits the number of questions we can address. All we learn in a randomized controlled trial is about an average causal effect, but that might not be what we want to know for many applications. It may introduce artifacts. I've mentioned that. People might not like the fact that they don't know, which group they're in, and behave in strange ways because of that. External validity problems loom large, and perhaps larger because a more artificial environment is created in these RCT studies than in observational studies, and perhaps therefore external validity problems, the problems of making inferences from the model to the population of interest are harder in this case. And also, randomized trials are a black box model. You add the treatment, you observe the outcome, but you're not incentivized to learn about why the outcome happens. So you're disincentivized to learning about the mechanisms that produce the outcome, actually. And that also gives us problems. And so, at any rate, but the main point is that subjective judgments have to be made either way. So one problem is, for instance, in real-world RCTs, very often the sample sizes are too small that you can't guarantee that the two groups, the treatment and the control group, are exactly balanced. And therefore, what is done in practice is usually that an econometric model is taken that controls for differences between the two groups. But then, of course, you introduce the exact same problems that you have to make these theoretical assumptions that you wanted to get rid of in the older work. And so, but you have to, because it's just not practicable, you have to do this. And so subjective judgments, and again, I'm in full agreement with Till here, these kinds of subjective judgments have to be made either way. And then lastly, I hope I do have 5 minutes or so. Freedom from value judgments. This again is also an ancient ideal. In social science it goes back to Max Weber, but at least probably before. Positive economics, or at least part of economics, is about what there is, not what there ought to be. Facts. We don't have a therapeutic ambition with economics. We just tell you what there is. Anyway, you realize that. In fact, however, value judgments are all over the place in all scientific work, and probably I don't have to convince you. But I do want to use the case of modeling as one example of this fact. And so here, what I want to use is so Michael Weisberg wrote a paper about 3 modeling strategies that he juxtaposes and analyzes, and he thinks that different modeling strategies have different qualities to help with certain goals of science. And these goals of science he calls representational ideals. So what do we want from a model? And different modeling strategies have different qualities in getting us what we want from these models. And here are his 5 or 6 ideals. So completeness, we want to model a phenomenon as completely as possible. Contrary to that, simplicity. In order to further understanding, we want to make the model as simple as possible. Related to that, but not the same, what he calls one causal is exactly this idea of focusing on an essential causal factor that is essential in the production of the outcome. So he calls that one causal. Max out, we want to maximize the accuracy of the simulation output. And lastly, what he calls P general. This is also related to understanding. So science should give us an account of the world that uses few principles but can derive lots and lots of phenomena. And so P general just means that the model can represent tons and tons and tons and tons of possible phenomena, not just actual but also possible phenomena. And now if we just apply this idea and look at the virtues of mathematical models versus computer simulations, we see that often they pull in different directions. So first, completeness. Well, as we said in the beginning, computer simulations are able, because there are fewer constraints, tractability constraints, they're able to model more complex phenomena. And so mathematical models aren't very good at completeness. Computer simulations, these are relative pluses and minuses, right? So they're relatively better. Of course, no computer simulation can model the entire world. However, they are much better at dealing with complexity than analytical mathematical models. Simplicity, well, probably the other way around. So economists don't get the right kind of simplicity, by which they mean, this derivation, the mathematical derivation from mathematical models. They understand computer simulations as black boxes, don't quite know what happens inside the black box, so they don't like that. So let us say, this is a charitable reading, let us say that mathematical models are better at simplicity. One causal, some people argue, Uuskallimaki is one of them, mathematical models do just that. They give us an account of what an individual causal factor does in the absence of disturbing factors. But computer simulations, of course, can do the same thing if you want to use them for that. Max out, well, mathematical models are actually very, very bad at predicting phenomena. Anyway, there's this large literature in economics about that. I won't defend that claim. Anybody who knows about economics knows that they're very bad at predictive accuracy. Simulations, of course, again, they can deal with more complex phenomena, so they're much better. Again, they might not be perfect and blah, 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 but they're better than mathematical models. And then p-generality, in some sense, again, you might say that mathematical models are quite good at that, because very often they're so abstract that you can interpret them in any way you want. So for instance, there's the hoteling model of spatial competition, and that predicts that under certain conditions, people will choose products in such a way that they are maximally similar to each other. And that you can apply to the market for cider, to the market for shoes, to the market for religions, and the market for political parties. So anyway, this is what hoteling did. And so in that sense, you might say, actually, they can do that. But anyway. But of course, computer simulations can do the same, right? If you just interpret the results so abstract. But the point is, where they differ, models and simulations tend to promote opposing goals, and that, of course, has value-laden consequences. It's just important whether what we get from a model is more explanation in certain senses, or better predictions, better policy advice. And so what I'm arguing here is, I think it's, well, actually it's in my conclusions, but what I'm arguing here is, because simulations just have these different qualities, they would enable, using them more would enable us to get sort of the range of values that are the right ones to hold or to promote better than just using one kind of modeling, namely mathematical modeling. So here then is my renewed attempt to plead for a more extensive and better use of simulation techniques in economics. There's no privileged economic aspect of social phenomena. Phenomena should be investigated as they appear significant to us. So it's surely very important to understand the causes of a recession, you would think. And simulations are much better at representing interactive causal factors, as has been argued. There's no empirical method that makes do without subjective assumptions altogether. Simulations fare no worse in this respect than experiments and econometric methods, but they are more flexible. And then modeling strategies do have normative implications. Some strategies are good at one thing, others are good at different things. And so we should get the mix right, so to speak. A slogan I use here is, there's no value-free lunch. Oh, sorry, I thought that was... and simulations and mathematical modeling have sometimes opposing virtues, and using simulations more would help economists to get sort of the, the menu of values right. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
have a few minutes before the coffee break.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian. Can you maybe go back to the comparison table?
Will take a while though.
Yeah, that's right. So I want to strongly disagree with you on the fourth, on the max out, because there is the problem of overfitting. And I think that computer simulations, because they tend to involve more variables and more free parameters, are more subject to overfitting than mathematical models. Now, what computer simulations do better is, of course, to replicate data, right? So we can, because, I mean, the more free parameters you have, the better you will be able to match the existing data set, and they can do that to perfection, while there is an inbuilt through the simplicity of mathematical analytical models, that's somewhat limited. But as soon as you extend it to actual predictive tasks, the overfitting that it is basically picking up on, for example, measurement errors in the existing data, is the computer simulations are much more subject to that than mathematical models. So here, I kind of disagree with you. And then, so that was one point, and then maybe the other point was the one causal. I don't have a strong disagreement with you, but I think it's an interesting question that's much more concerning the practice of computer simulation. You mentioned before that RCTs are black boxes, but I mean, going back to Lehtinen and Kurakowski, what you mentioned, and computer simulation in some way is sometimes also treated as a sort of, let's say, as an opaque box, not a black box. It's sort of like, okay, there's a lot of stuff in there, but we don't really treat that usually. Many computer simulations have not treated the underlying model as a sort of mechanistic model, for example, but instead stuff was put in there in order to replicate the data set well, generate empirical data, something of that sort, and then not much attention was paid to the underlying mechanism. So I'm not sure to what extent, I mean, this is not a real disagreement. I'm a little concerned here to say that, okay, computer simulations, I mean, in practice it seems as if a lot is not really focused, for example, on identifiable causal factors and their, so maybe the first one is more.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, both points are entirely fair enough. Perhaps just to explain the first point, so in curve fitting, there's always a trade-off between accuracy, between fit, and then say simplicity. So you can always make to fit a linear equation, a linear model to the data, but then the fit won't be great. On the other hand, you can always find some polynomial that fits exactly the data, but then it will be very high order, very complex. Now there are arguments to the effect that for prediction, it's very often better to be on the simpler side because of overfitting. So that's essentially the problem. Until is saying, well, look, if you can model the data so well, then you are risking overfitting. I entirely agree that's a risk, but of course it's a matter of how you use these simulations. And if you understand that, well, there is this trade-off between fit and simplicity, and very often the simpler models are in fact better for prediction, then you can use that piece of information to just to get it to get it exactly right for the simulations that you're making, and in that respect, simulations simply are more flexible than the mathematical models, which are more constrained. So I agree with the point, but of course it's a contingent point, right? How you use it has nothing to do with intrinsic characteristics with simulation modeling, but rather with the use. But then, of course, with respect to the other point, that's exactly, you might say that is exactly true of randomized trials as well, right? So it's only contingently true that researchers are led to ignore why a causal factor holds when they've tested that it does in fact why a causal effect is there when it in fact is there. And here I can only say I entirely agree, and there's nothing, I have nothing against randomized trials, unlike some of my colleagues. I think it is just that, in economics they're often praised, credibility revolution, they're praised as the gold standard, they're praised as the panacea to all these problems, and they're simply not. There are all these problems involved with them, and so you have to use them right, and they're not always applicable. When they are applicable, very often you can't use them to address the questions that you want to address, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are just problems, and where having a broader spectrum of methods that you use could overcome.
Question commentaire?
I think I wanted to agree with your sort of normative story. I'm very sympathetic to this, and I think simulation should be used. But I mean, if you sort of propose the diagnosis that people are led by a sort of strange idol of objectivity, that this is sort of cause why they don't use simulations. I mean, I'm not quite sure if this is possible, because I mean, what's strange about economics is that they are very much in the business of modeling it all. I mean, there are other subjects like statistical physics and so on. They had certain problems to accustom to simulations because they had a different sort of style of theorizing. But I thought in economics you're already using models, so you should be happy to use simulations. So, and I mean, if it's the idea that, I mean, these sorts of idealized models are, so to speak, the true aspects of the whole thing, the Platonic ideas, the forms, and that's why you have to stick to them, whatever might happen in the real world. But that seems to me a very, very sort of implausible story. I can't believe that.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, I'm just trying at a diagnosis of the problem. I mean, it's just a mystery. Really, it's a mystery to me why, given the properties that socioeconomic systems do have, why simulation isn't used more often. And so I'm just trying to, find, well, here's an explanation. Well, it's a mistaken ideal of objectivity, because objectivity seems to be a good thing, and they interpret it in a certain way, and then, that leads to these problems. But there's a certain implausibility. I mean, I entirely agree. But, I thought, I mean, if you just keep emphasizing, for instance, that, well, value-free science isn't possible, full stop, and then using values in this particular context might not be so unpalatable anymore. I mean, that's sort of the strategy. So it's just an attempt, really.
Other questions, comments? Yes?
Well, it seems to me that in climate science, for instance, modeling has started some time ago, but not that long ago. I mean, the respect for modelers or modeling results is not that old, right? And still, there is, I think the 3% you were mentioning for economics is much higher in climate science. We need models, we know that. So why this difference? Would the history of economical modeling as compared to climate modeling, has there been works about that? I know there are also differences. We have probably the chance, or we are lucky enough to have equations, fluid dynamics and stuff like that. We have some observations, not as much as we would like. What about the observations in economics? I mean, what link can you make between the two?
Yeah, no, I mean, Kevin Hoover once wrote in a review of something I'd written that economics is awash in data. So surely there are data. But there aren't any accepted fundamental principles. I mean, and that's surely a problem. I mean, I understand that in climate modeling there are certain sort of natural laws that almost everybody accepts, and then of course the question is what to do with them and so on. But I mean, essentially there are certain fundamental principles. Differences, I don't know. I mean, I do think that there are differences in values. I mean, that and this has to do with an ideal of, these ideals of objectivity. I mean, there could be a different ideal that, we need to, I mean, in climate science, it seems that it's really important to get certain predictions right. And for some weird reason, economists don't don't really focus on that. I mean, a lot of the modeling goes into building more theoretical models that, you know, allegedly enhance our understanding of certain phenomena, but that aren't very good at predicting novel phenomena, you know, predicting the future anyway. And that's surely a difference in value, that, you know, but what explains that difference, I can't say really.
Yeah, yeah.
It's extremely surprising.
Yeah.
So huge financial stakes.
But look, I mean, like here, this guy, sorry, I now have to
We
get his.
expect society to put pressure on economists to do predictions.
Sorry, I just have to put poor Eugene Farmer back on. I mean, this is the funny thing, actually. So people like this, Eugene Farmer and many others, have provided mathematical proofs that prediction is impossible in economics. And many, many economists believe in that. So your best prediction of tomorrow's, I don't know, what's in France, the CAC 40? CAC 40, sorry. The best prediction of its value tomorrow is the value today. You know, that's because it's all random and there's no way, and that's false, right? But there are theoretical reasons for believing that you cannot predict the economy. And there's a huge and influential strand in both financial microeconomics, but also macroeconomics, that these kinds of predictions are all in vain, that you cannot predict the economy, that you shouldn't intervene because interventions will actually undermine and can only be bad, and you know, and so on and so forth, because you essentially can't predict what happens under an intervention. And there's a lot of theoretical work on exactly these kinds of things. And so, I mean, it is strange, but there's a lot of theoretical work that backs up this disinterest in prediction. He doesn't think that anything is predictable in the financial markets. But then, of course, he made a lot of money with some hedge fund that he put.